Hi everyone, and welcome to another of our Evolving HR live sessions. This one today is one that I've been looking forward to. I don't know if that's the right expression, looking forward to, but it's a conversation that I feel like we've needed to have for some time. And some of you will remember this all kind of started last summer because somebody had told me that they had been lifted off the ground by the throat at work by somebody when they were holding a disciplinary meeting. And I remember thinking at the time, my God, I didn't even realize that happened. Like, I've experienced multiple verbal abuse from people and verbal threats and things like that, but I'd never experienced anything physical. So I put a little poll out on LinkedIn and was absolutely horrified by the number of people that came back with examples of, actual physical threats and physical violence directed towards them as HR professionals just in the course of doing their jobs. So it's something that I now realize is a much bigger problem than I ever knew before, and also one that we don't really talk about. So that's what we're going to do today. And I've got a pretty awesome panel with me today. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, but I've tried to pull together people with a lot of mixed areas of expertise. So Kelly, do you want to go first and just, for anybody who doesn't know, tell us who you are and why you're here?
Sure. So, hi, I am Kelly Swingler. I am now, for my sins and for everything that I love doing, I now coach and train burnout. So I'm a global burnout educator, but I'm here today in my capacity of an ex-HR director. Kirsty and I have had conversations about the particular scenario that I will share with you all today. But yes, I'm here today as in the capacity of ex-HR director, we may get onto the conversation of burnout, but we may not. I'm just here today as ex-HR director to have the conversation because I, again, like Kirsty, I'm kind of really, really shocked with all of this stuff. But of course, then I suppose if I link it to my professional stuff, the more we know, the more toxicity we've got in workplaces, the more issues that we've got in workplaces, the more likely we are to reach burnout anyway. So we'll see where we go. Yeah,
absolutely. Darren, would you like to introduce yourself?
Certainly, Kelly. So my name's Darren Good and I run Good Sense Training. We specialise in personal safety training. We're very cross-sector now. We started off in the NHS and then I realised I didn't want all my eggs in one basket, and there was callings from other sectors that they wanted training in personal safety. Started very, very much in the public sector, but recently we're starting to move into the corporate sector, and the banking industry really have taken it by the horns and really taking this type of training really seriously now.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks for joining us today. And Jules.
Pleasure.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks, Kirsty. Today I am here in the capacity of a mediator, and that's workplace, civil and commercial. My background is also ex-HR and leading people teams. So probably the reason why I stepped away and started mediating in the first place, if I'm honest, or one of them. So really looking forward to this conversation today and getting into the nitty-gritty.
Brilliant. Thank you all of you for being here. Kelly, I'm going to start with you. So I know that you experienced physical violence yourself in an HR role. Can you tell us what happened and what kind of went through your mind during that and after that in the days that followed?
Yeah, so it was a physical threat. So I suppose some background. So there was a particular guy who, whenever he would come into HR, he was in HR frequently for lots and lots of different reasons. But I had already spoken to managers and leaders and the CEO within the organization, because this particular guy, when he would come in, if he was kind of coming in to talk to you, like he would almost be like sat on my lap as we were trying to have conversations. And I was like, can we kind of back away? I'd be kind of moving my chair. He'd move closer. And it was really, really uncomfortable. And every time he came into the office, would he do the same thing? And I was like, right, we're not having this conversation until we've got some, we've got some kind of space. So this had been going on. He ended up then in a couple of disciplinaries. And in one of those disciplinaries, the decision had been made to terminate his contract. And that termination, of course, as we all know, right? So HR was the one that sacked him. as we've been there, right? HR sacked him, but he stood up in this meeting and pretty much kind of went to kind of literally physically go for me across the table, calling me every name under the sun, like, this is your fault, this is your problem, this is whatever, but threatened to actually shoot me in this meeting. Now, of course, I've had threats before. I genuinely never thought that there would be a physical threat with a gun. And that night I had been, I usually kind of stayed late to kind of work through a few bits whilst kind of everybody had left the office. And that night I left the office. Our car park for the organisation was across the road. I had walked across the road to the car park. My car was the only one left in the car park. And he had literally parked in his Land Rover Defender with the back open, stood opposite my car with his back open to his Defender, with a line of shotguns. And there he stood with a shotgun in his hand, literally pointing towards my car. So I legged it straight back to the office, went to go and find the caretaker, told the caretaker stayed with me, then walked me back over. This guy had gone. Spoke to them, kind of just mentioned it the following day, but it was almost like, well, it's just what happens. For weeks afterwards, and I mean weeks afterwards, I was convinced that every time I walked into town at lunchtime, I was seeing this guy. And everybody was just like, well, you're just imagining it. Now, I can't say whether I was or not, but nobody seemed to care at all that I had been threatened. This guy had literally kind of tried to launch himself across the desk at me because HR had sacked him. And there was a guy with actual shotguns and holding a shotgun opposite my car whilst I was the only one left in the car park. And nobody really kind of did anything, said anything, worried about it, no investigation, no conversation, no, do you need any support? No, do you need anything? And it was just kind of seen that it's just part and parcel of the role of HR. Now, I've had lots of threats before. I've had lots, we're going to kill your family. We know where you live. We're going to kind of deal with this. But actually, a lot of that was just kind of, I suppose, throwaway words. But this was the first time that I actually felt physically threatened for my life, and nobody did a thing.
It's one of those stories that just leaves you speechless. But that was such a common thing with the comments that people left last year, was there were other people there. No one said anything. No one did anything.
Because we're HR, right? And again, I think that's the thing. I think the assumption just is it's part and parcel of the job. But actually, we're not working in front line, right? We're not working in environments where our physical, mental, or emotional health or safety should actually be being threatened. Yeah. To all intents and purposes, right? We're a people support, like we're an admin function, right? At the end of the day, if we kind of take all of the people side out of it, right? We are a support function that supports. Well, we're there to support people. And yet, the expectation, if that had been another manager, if that had been another employee, I would have been tasked with ensuring that individual had everything that they needed, that they were support. Maybe police would have been notified, all of that kind of stuff. Yeah. But actually, for me, it was, it's HR. Like, we don't need to do it. And like I said, even when I was convinced I was seeing him for weeks afterwards in town, I was just basically told it must just be your imagination. Like, just get on with it.
It's absolutely shocking. It's interesting because you said you're not front line. And Darren, I know that you work. So I'm already going off piste with the questions that I sent you guys in advance.
We knew you would do anyway, Kirsty, really, didn't we?
It's like, where is it going to take me? Darren, you work with a lot of organizations where you would consider those employees to be frontline, as it were. But I still don't think that it's normal or acceptable for them to experience physical violence. I think you know that it might happen in certain types of work. Like if you're, I don't know, an arresting police officer and you're dealing with, aggressive criminals and people, you kind of understand, but they're trained to deal with that. Some of the types of organizations that you work with, it's not taken into consideration, isn't it? And people aren't people don't know what to expect and they don't know how to deal with it. I don't think it should ever be like, that just goes with the territory, should it?
I think that story is really shocking, actually, and I'm really, really surprised that your employers didn't take it more seriously. If that happened in the NHS, there'd have been a serious investigation. I mean, first of all, turning up at work with shotguns is actually assault because of the way it made you feel. So people think assault's just physical, but it's not. If it frightens you and it makes you think that you're in threat of your own life, then already you've been assaulted. So as far as I'm concerned, that was an assault, and that should have been investigated by the police. In terms of the training we do, conflict resolution became mandatory in the NHS back in 2004. And that's because in 2003, there was a massive increase of violence and aggression towards NHS staff. And so 2004, they decided to mandate it across all frontline staff. Now, what's the definition of frontline? If you're in front of an employee giving them what they might perceive as bad news, then you're frontline, aren't you? Mm-hmm. So I think HR professionals certainly giving news to people like that are definitely frontline. Mm-hmm. If there's a risk, then there should be steps taken to reduce that risk. And once it's happened, it becomes what's known as a foreseeable risk under Health and Safety at Work Act as well. So not only should that have been investigated and taken seriously, so as I'm concerned, that was an assault, then further steps should have been taken to reduce that chances of that happening again in that environment. You can't say it's not going to happen because it has happened and there's evidence it's already happened. So the NHS now, all staff have minimum of a one-day course, not just from us, but other training companies on conflict resolution. And that's a minimum training. And then if they have a perceived risk of higher than that, then they get extra training as well, which might include a breakaway training, for example, or restraint training. Yeah.
God. It's I know I'm going to be sighing a lot during this conversation. Jules, let me ask you, from a mediation perspective, you'll have been in some fairly highly charged situations in the past. Where do they sort of start to tip from difficult to dangerous? Are there signs that you've noticed that people sometimes miss?
There can be. Sometimes I think it's a little bit before mediation, though. So to get to the point that you're mediating anyway, there's something often gone wrong. They usually bring mediation in way too late. It should be so much earlier before we've ever got to the point where somebody's being aggressive in whichever way, shape or form that comes over. Typically, if I'm mediating, I'll speak to the person beforehand so you can get a really good gauge of who they are, how they show up, what their normal is, where their limits and their boundaries are, and you can test those. So talking to them about how they feel with you playing devil's advocate and so on, and they'll kind of quite visibly bristle, or something will happen. There'll be a change in the cheeks, change in the posture, change in the voice. I'm not going to do that. So all that stuff will come out. If it's in a mediation situation, sadly, what you don't get with workplace that you do get with something really horrible in a civil situation. If you've got contentious folks and you're dealing with civil mediation, you can call in the police and have them there. In the workplace, you can't do that. So you're going with a little bit of what's going to happen on the day and assessing where that person is, watching, hearing, looking for all the signs that they're changing, either their tone of voice, their body language. So you can call a break and call some time out. They might not even be together at that point. It might even be with you. If it were to tip and be a little bit too dangerous, then you could call time, full stop. But often you can bring somebody back from that. But just listening to what Kelly was saying, what Darren was saying, I've got this thing in my head that kind of struck me years and years and years ago in a really horrid situation with an employee wearing a HR hat here. And I was being abused both online and being stalked. And it was so bad. And in the capacity of HR, I think it's very easy for us to often say, well, you know, you cut some slack to the person. And I was on the phone with counsel, and he said to me, Jules, if this was someone else, what would you say? And it was instant. I gave a response, and he said, why can't you apply the same to yourself? And that stayed with me throughout, and probably part of the reason why mediation became so interesting too, because we cut people a lot of slack even in the worst situations, because we're not kind of trained from a HR perspective. This stuff shows up and we're unprepared for it. So I've kind of been thinking about that as you've been talking too, but from a mediation, anything that we can kind of call time, break the situation, we'd definitely be on the lookout for.
Why do you think it is that if we're in roles where we're dealing with volatile situations, and it's not, the way I phrase this is, it's not that everything we deal with is volatile, but if there is a volatile situation, we have to be there. So anytime that comes up, there's an HR person in the room. Why do you think it is that we don't get the same protection that other high-risk roles do? And whose responsibility is it to fix that?
I was thinking a lot about this because, you know, if you look at every single, I'm not a fan of a policy, but if you look at one, guess who's the point of escalation 9 times out of 10? It's the HR person. Like, where do you go if you're HR? So you've kind of got that going on, and I think we do a lot for organisations. So as these people don't have to do some of this stuff, shame on us, right? So yeah.
How about you, Kelly? What are your thoughts on that?
Again, I think it's a mix. I think there needs to, I think Jules is right. In most policies and procedures, it's going to say, like, the buck stops with HR, right? But I also think there needs to be more and more. And as you said, right, just your pollen and stuff from last year. This is like, I'm not saying everybody has had the severity that I have, but the physical violence, the threat of violence, the shouting, the name calling, all of that stuff, it's always been present in HR. And again, I think it's kind of seen as it's just part of the job. I think there's two things. I think there needs to be, every single organization needs an escalation for HR, right? If I as an HR director was needing to put in a grievance, or somebody was needing to discipline me or whatever, that would be an escalation perspective. When it comes to the health and safety and well-being of HR, there needs to be an escalation. Whether that comes from the CEO, whether that's coming from the COO, whether that's coming from somebody externally, I think there absolutely has to be that. And we as individuals, I keep saying we, you know, I'm not anymore, but my heart is still very much the you know, in the kind of HR space. So I'm still the royal we. But I also think we need to be better at asking for what it is that we need, right? We need support. We need to be heard. We need to be listened to. We need training. We need all sorts of stuff. I mean, you know, again, I had been in other situations. I remember one particular, I won't go into the details on this call, but I had been asked to deal with one specific individual. I knew I was not safe going into that situation. Now, the organisation that I worked in at the time, we had one meeting room for members of the public that would come in that actually had a panel and a screen. So you would kind of go round into like a door at the back of this meeting. My gut told me that I needed to be in a protected space when I met with that particular individual. And my gut was right. But had I not have asked for that, nobody else would have thought to offer it, even though I kind of had that. And, you know, I suppose in that instance, I was lucky that our building, our organisation, our offices had that room in the first place, because that could have again turned into a very, very different situation. So I think there is dual responsibility between the leadership of the organisation, but also for us as HR.
Totally agree.
There's that zero tolerance piece too, isn't there? Because sometimes I was thinking as you're talking, and you know, where you've got the high performer bringing in all the numbers, and they can do it at all costs in some organisations, and that's not okay. And if they're being protected by someone else who is, you know, more senior and equally probably as appalling with their behaviour, that doesn't help either. So.
But I also think, Jules, to add to that, I think the lack of the lack of disrespect toward HR in the first place from lots of people within the organisation, right? Kirsty, I know you've done kind of sessions on this before, right? But like, you know, my name is Kelly, my name is not HR, right? Oh, HR's in the room. Like, you know, you get spoken down to, you kind of get all of that. Now, again, that doesn't excuse any kind of violence, however that is, whether it's verbal, whether it's physical or anything else. But I also think where you kind of said zero tolerance there also needs to be kind of zero tolerance, firstly, towards that complete lack of respect. Like, you're not seen as a person, right? You're not seen as a human being. You are HR. And so you just have to put up with whatever we're going to chuck at you, right? And it's almost like everybody in the organization has free reign to speak to you and treat you however they want anyway, because you're just HR. And so I think, you know, if we're talking zero tolerance, like, that needs to stop at that point, because I think the fact that, and you know, and even, you know, when if I'm coming back to that situation, there were 2 managers in that room with me that saw this guy launch across the table with me and threaten me with a gun. Nobody checked on me afterwards.
It's disgusting.
Nobody said, what do you need? No, you know, there was none of that. And there were 2 other managers in that room with me. So there wasn't even, from a human to human perspective, right? Take the job role and job title out of it. There wasn't even a human to human aspect of, Kelly, are you okay? That must have been a pretty scary situation for you. What do you need? There was none of that.
It beggars belief. I've remembered as well, while I've been listening to you, there were a couple of times where the business got external security in when we had to terminate a particular individual, and they'd be like, we can get security in case you need help getting them out of the building. But I realized that was not something I was able to ask for or ever ask for. It was only when somebody else decided it might be difficult, but they'd still send me in there. Like, I'm 5'3", and, you know, I'm not big built, and I've been doing termination meetings since I was 25. So you send in this little 25-year-old, and you've got security because you think it might turn nasty, but you're okay still sending me in there to do that. It was really
with
bizarre.
No training, with nothing to talk about what safety is, with nothing to do with self-defense, with nothing about, and again, you know, maybe kind of Darren covers this in training. You know, my mum's a mediator. You know, my mum was told, you know, where you sit in the room, where you position yourself, what do you do if there's a physical threat? How do you deal with this? How do you deal with that? How do you deal with the other? We don't get taught that in HR, right? Yeah. We don't get told where to sit. We don't get told what to do if somebody's threatening us. We don't get told what to do if somebody launches themselves across a desk at us and starts threatening us with shotguns. There's no, and again, like to Darren's point, right? It happens, and so we need to be doing something with it. But actually, and to your point there, Kirsty, right? If you know that security can be called in certain situations, where's the kind of heads up? Where's the training? Where's the support for HR in the first place to say there might be some really volatile situations that might come up, and this is what you do in these situations? Nobody does that. We just get handed a policy, right, and get told this is what the meeting needs to look like. See you later. 100%. Right, but if anybody else gets threatened, guess who's got to do the investigation? HR, Alf.
Yeah, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit in what I plan to talk about, because I think it kind of fits really nicely. Darren, if someone's going into a situation that might potentially be volatile, what are some of the things that they can think about before they even have that conversation with someone? So I know we talked about this a bit when we had our kind of intro call, and there's some really useful information, isn't there? Things about, you know, just how to set up the room and those sorts of things that might help.
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, a lot of this work has already been done in the NHS, so we can take advantage of the work that's out there. And the good thing about the NHS, as you know, is they deal with everybody. So everybody is a member of the NHS, whether they're young, professional, work in the public sector, or suffer from dementia or any other issues. So we already know what can work in these type of situations. Now, there was a big study done in about 10 to 15 years ago, and it was looking at mental health units up and down the country, and why certain mental health units had more levels of violence and aggression compared to other mental health units. And one of the factors that increase violence and aggression towards staff was actually giving bad news, which links very nicely into what we're talking about here, because obviously in a HR role, quite often you'll be giving news to people that they don't want to hear.
Yeah.
So we know that the way that news is delivered can make a difference to the way that people respond. And that study was called Safe Wards. So it's in the public domain. If you Google Safe Wards, Professor Len Bowers, and he looked at what factors increase the risk of violence towards staff and what factors decrease the risk towards staff. The other thing that jumps out at me, we're talking a lot about policies and procedures here, but policies and procedures should come out of what legal frameworks suggest. So the sort of legal frameworks that would protect you here is, first of all, the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, Section 2, which is employers should look after the health and safety of employees. That's Section 2. Section 3 is others, i.e. guests of the business. And then what came later, after the Health and Safety at Work, was the Management Regulations 99, which is where the term risk assessment comes from. So there should be somebody within the organisation that's risk assessing these types of situations. And then once we know what that risk might be, or that perceived risk, steps should be put in place to reduce that risk. So, for example, you might think giving bad news to person A might be low risk, person B medium risk, and person C high risk. The low risk, maybe you've got HR professionals trained to deliver bad news at low risk. Medium risk might be the same professionals but supported by champions within the organizations that are trained to a higher level to deal with risk. And then at a high level, it may be, you mentioned security, but what they do in the NHS when staff might be giving bad news to patients, security aren't necessarily in the same room, but they're in the room next door. Yeah. So staff know they're supported, and people can be in that room quickly if extra support is needed. And that helps the NHS staff have confidence to deliver that news and to deliver that news in a professional way. So that's just an example of how risk could be managed. Interestingly, there was a mention about the way you set a room up. We know that the way the room is set up does make a difference, and it would be worth professionals looking at the room that they're going to be working in with before they give bad news as well, and the way that they set the room up. You almost want to be doing the opposite of what happens. If you watch the TV program The Apprentice, you'll notice that it's actually set up to be gladiatorial. You've got the competitors, and it is a competition, in a room with a massive board table, which is seen as an ocean and a barrier to communication. And then you've got the people delivering the news, Lord Sugar and his associates, with very, very large chairs, which tower above the chairs of the people that are in that room. And you'll also notice that Lord Sugar enters the room last to show that he's the most important person in the room. So we know how not to set up a room. And if you look at Safe Wards as well, the research is being done at actually how to set up a room. So, for example, the people within the room should have the equal distance from the door so that anybody could leave the room if they wanted to. And nobody, whether it's a member of the staffing team or whether it's the person getting the news, is hemmed in any way. And I think it's good practice that everybody realizes that we can have time out, and anybody at any point could leave the room, disappear, go for a walk, have a cup of tea or a glass of water, walk around the block or whatever needs to happen to get back into the right emotional state, and then re-enter the room and enter into those discussions. Or maybe those discussions are postponed for a certain amount of time so that people can get their head round the process that they're going through.
It seems quite a simple thing, doesn't it, to organise a room in a way that's going to be conducive to a more amicable conversation. I don't think I ever gave that a second's thought. In any termination meeting I've ever done, I was invariably behind the table, and the person came in and they sat at the front of the table by the door, and I was against the table at the back, because that's just the way the rooms were set up. And I'm interested, for those of you who've joined us today, just in the chat, I would love to hear, have any of you ever thought about how to set up a room for a conversation like that? Have any of you given that any thought? And also, have any of you had any kind of support or training or even policies in your organization that provide you with any kind of protection against this kind of thing? I'm just interested. I think I already know that everybody's going to go, no, I haven't. No, I haven't. I'll be very surprised. Oh my God, someone said yes. Oh my God.
Kind of, like mediation type training, right? Unless there has been like conflict resolution or mediation training or kind of any of that sort of stuff. Again, I think the majority of us are just, you've got disciplinary, you've got a grievance, you've got interview, you've got whatever. Off you go.
Yeah. Mediation is an interesting one, because I would kind of, if you're in person, I would take that away from the workplace, somewhere completely neutral. That helps settle down to as best as possible. You definitely don't need a cheer squad, outside of each door, riling people up. Or online, it can be easier because you can separate the rooms. But yeah.
It's interesting. And Justine's put in the comment, I was given training on how to lay someone off and best practice. I wasn't. Were you, Kelly and Jules? I think I once went on handling difficult conversations, but it didn't specifically cover telling someone.
I never even had that. I mean, all the years that I did it, it was kind of like, here's the policy. I mean, you just had to kind of, you kind of learnt it as you went, right? Maybe you were a note taker in one meeting, so you were kind of watching what was going on. Then I think kind of intuition kicks in, and you think, actually, I don't like how that was done. I want to change it a bit differently. I suppose for some of it with me, because my background, I've said this throughout a lot of my kind of HR. I think because I started my entire career in retail, and you had to do a certain amount of time on the shop floor, it was very much like it was about the customer.
Yeah.
And I think that always, and maybe that did kind of stem, maybe it's just always been in me. But I think then when, from kind of like being in the HR space, it was very much like it was about the person. Like, how can I make this better for the person, whatever it is that you're saying to them, right? To always put them first. And that's why, again, we've had conversations with it before, but, again, towards the latter years of my career, a lot of kind of campaigning and talks and stuff that I was doing, right, about people before policies, because actually, what does the individual need in front of you, right? Forget what the bloody policy says, but what does that individual say? And I think some of that started from my retail career, because it was about the person, like the customer, and how you could help them. And so I think, throughout my career, it was actually like, I don't like how we're doing this. I don't like that this is just the policy. So I kind of, but nobody was teaching me or training me or giving me a best practice or a framework or any of that sort of stuff. It was just like figuring it out myself and working some of this stuff through.
And I think the problem with the policies is it holds you so tight and within, such narrow parameters.
Yeah.
The person ends up really fed up because they can't be heard. So actually their backstory plays into what's going on right there and then. And it's like, no, we only want to focus on this bullet point, as in the letter or as in the policy. And it escalates and they get more and more cross. And it's like the other day I was dealing with someone and they were at the point, the actual conversation I was having was they were so frustrated that they wanted to torch the company van. So this was the starting point. And I'm like, okay. So having that conversation, all that needed to happen, quite simply, was that the person needed to be heard, and they hadn't been heard, and it had snowballed into this horrible thing with all this frustration, anger, foul language, you name it. It was all in the mix, and ending with a lighter, and actually pulling them back from that started with them being able to get it all out. I don't mind what that looks like, as long as it's, kind of, you're taking them back down again. But yeah, they just needed to be heard. The reason it had got to that point was because the policy says, and the person said no, and yeah, it was crazy, and it got to that point. So it happens quite often.
Just noticed the comment that Donna has put in the chat that policy doesn't cover all scenarios. I was locked in a bank while working late at night by a colleague.
Oh, crikey. That sounds horrific.
Oh my God. That's horrendous, Donna. It's just, it's awful.
Yeah.
Jules, you
and
kind of,
it doesn't cover all policy. It doesn't.
No, it can't possibly, because no two people react the same way to news, or we're all different. It's as you were talking before, I remembered I was given 2 pieces of guidance before I first had to terminate someone on my own. Don't touch them and don't apologise.
Right.
That was it.
So I'll add a third.
Don't say sorry.
But never let your face show emotion. They were the 2 instructions I had, that I was ever given in terms of in terms of that, which was do not apologise for anything, and never let your face show emotion.
It's hardly surprising we have a bad reputation, isn't it, when we're told to basically be robots when we're ruining someone's year.
My HR training, right? Everything else I kind of figured out myself, but they were the 2 pieces, but they were reiterated in every single organisation that I went into.
And don't say I know how you feel. That was the other one. Don't say I know how you feel, because you don't.
So it's, so again, it's not to excuse. I can see how people get irritated to the point of not violence, but I can see how people get to that emotional state that we are the ones that it gets lashed, that we're the ones that get the brunt of it. But again, I think that starts from culture of the organization and goes back to what I was saying earlier, because if we are disrespected by every manager and every other employee and every leader in the organization anyway, of course, we're going to end up as like the physical and metaphorical punching bags, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Darren, you mentioned before about having the opportunity to leave the room, and that's an option for people. There are often times where people stay even when they know they should probably leave, or they don't realise, but they definitely should probably leave. What do you think makes it harder for people to get up and leave the room?
I think it's probably a number of factors in the corporate world. I mean, first of all, being British, there's a stiff upper lip that we seem to have in this country.
Yeah, true.
And I think in the corporate world, it's a professional thing to see it to the end. There's maybe a belief that that's what they're meant to do. And I don't think the corporate world realise that duty of care, which is talked about, the most important duty of care is to yourself. And how can you do a good job for others if you're not in a good place yourself? So if it's not working out the way that you want it to work out, and your intuition, there's been a mention of intuition quite a bit already today, then that's the right time to take a break in the meeting and take that time out. So it works both ways, not just for the HR professional, it's for the person receiving the bad news and the person delivering the bad news. At any point, they can have the time out. And I think that links to how you leave the room as well, because if you, for example, if you just storm off, that could send a message of easy prey, and therefore you might be more likely to be stalked in the future. So there's a way of leaving the room in a professional way where you look confident, but you're letting the person who's receiving the bad news realize that meeting can't continue in that way, in the way that it's going, and that we need to both take time out to re-establish the ground rules and come back and start again, rather than carrying on going down a route that's just not working out for anybody. So I think the way you set up the room is important as well, because it's much easier if you set the room up in a certain way that anybody can leave that meeting at any point. And I think it's important to realise how long that meeting might last for. If you're taking into consideration there might be the meeting might stop and start, then we need more time factored into that meeting, depending on the perceived risk beforehand.
And you mentioned risk assessment before. what are some of the, I mean, how does one assess the potential risk of a termination meeting or a disciplinary meeting? I mean, because so much of that is down to the individual that you're talking to, but are there certain things that you would take into consideration when doing that?
So you can look at risk in different ways. So first of all, there's a model called Kaplan and Wheeler, which is used a lot in the NHS, which is looking at people's baseline behaviour. So it's understanding what the baseline behaviour of that individual is normally at work, and where that baseline behaviour has gone to. So if they're already triggered off their baseline, obviously risk has increased. If they continue to be escalated before the meeting itself, and other members of staff might see that, they may be very, very close to going into crisis. And once somebody goes into crisis, no de-escalation strategies are going to be successful anyway. So that member of staff's not really in a good place to go into a meeting where they're going to receive bad news. If you look at the NHS, if they're going to give somebody bad news, they're going to try and not deliver it while somebody's massively off their baseline. They're going to try and avoid that at all costs. And then looking at previous behaviours of that individual, and maybe having a bit of an idea of what they've done in the past in terms of certain roles as well. There's obviously certain roles they may be, being violent and aggressive towards people might be more normal for them. So I don't really want to pick on certain professions, but if somebody's ex-military or ex-police, for example, or worked in a high secure mental health hospital, they may be desensitized to aggressive behavior and therefore think that behavior is actually okay in a corporate setting. So knowing the background of the individual, knowing what their normal behaviors are and what their behaviors are now, and comparing them now to what they used to be, and I guess picking up information from other members of staff, other team members about where they are in that process, where they are in terms of their mindset before having a meeting with them.
And that, I don't think that happens in a lot of organisations. I think that we adopt a one-size-fits-all approach to termination meetings and disciplinaries, and it's just luck whether the person kicks off or not, basically. Abida asked a question in the chat saying, could Darren please take us through risk assessment and what he means by champion in medium risk? So
if you look at training, for instance, I mean, most organizations that we deal with will train about once a year, and they'll either get a 1 day or a 2 day or a 3 day course, depending on what we're doing. So conflict res, for example, might be a 1 day course. If they're doing breakaway training, it might be a 2 day course. But the problem with that is, if you look at if you look at a conflict resolution course, if you test somebody after a month, they'll only remember about 10% of what they learnt on a course. So what organizations are starting to do now, we're working with organizations where we train internal champions. So we'll train all staff, the frontline staff, yearly, but we'll do more training sessions with select group of individuals within that organization that have an interest in this topic area and want to be champions in that area where they can offer support to their colleagues at work. And those champions could then therefore be involved in these meetings if the perceived risk is of maybe a medium risk, and could be involved in, to support the HR staff whilst they're delivering that sort of news.
To my mind, that would be as helpful as having designated first aiders in an office and fire marshals, which we've always had to have in every company I've ever worked in. You should have somebody that is able to, I like that champion idea. I think that's something fairly practical that most organizations would benefit from. I mean, my HR brain goes to, you couldn't have them in the room because of confidentiality kind of thing, but you could always have them available.
Can I challenge the confidentiality? Because in the hierarchy of law, confidentiality is below health and safety at work. And Human Rights Act top trumps confidentiality as well. You know.
But maybe if you had an environment where they existed, then the people within that environment would know that they have somebody that they can go to, because they can bring them in anyway, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
So there has been false information originally in the NHS, because data protection is such a big thing, especially in the NHS. There's been beliefs that staff members can't share information because of patient confidentiality. In terms of legal frameworks, that's just not true. If there's a risk, then information can be shared to reduce that risk, because Health and Safety at Work Act top trumps data protection and GDPR anyway.
That's really important. Yeah, I think that's really important. I also think you're probably sending a signal as an organization. If you've taken the time to train people in conflict resolution and you have a champion for that in your organization, it's kind of like a declaration that you won't stand for it. And that you're not prepared to tolerate it. And so that feels like something that most organizations could do fairly easily and fairly inexpensively, that would, you never know, maybe it would discourage people from, maybe it would make people pause for thought if they knew that it was something that their organization took seriously. I genuinely don't think that people realize how often it happens.
No.
I think people think it's really isolated, but the LinkedIn poll.
Again, if you think about it, Kirsty,
sorry, go on.
If it were happening more widely across the organization, I think everybody would know about it. The reason we don't know that it's happening in the context of today's conversation is because it's happening to HR. So we don't talk about it. If it was happening to managers more widely across the organization, or individuals more widely across the organization, or leaders across the organization, then we would be talking about it. We'd have emails, we'd have campaigns, we'd have meetings, we would probably have champions, right? Yeah. We'd have all sorts of people that are out there kind of doing that stuff. When it is HR, I thought it was quite interesting. I think Darren said something about the policy earlier, and I think there was a certain phrase in certain wording in there about like employees and the safety of employees. I think probably what would would literally be like employees and HR, right? And it sounds like a really ridiculous caveat to say, but again, even from an HR perspective, we know it, right? Whether we're talking about training or well-being or whatever else, it's like the people in the organization and HR, right? And HR need bringing closer to that policy, to that conversation, right? We will not tolerate it for anybody within the organization, including HR. Yeah. Right. We need this level of support for the people within the organization, including HR. We need safe working environments for everybody, including HR. And lots of people wouldn't even think that was important. But your poll, the fact that we're seeing it all of the time, the fact that HR are seen as, kind of separate to the rest of the organization, like there's kind of one rule for the organization and another rule for HR. That's the stuff that needs challenging. Like you wouldn't get away with speaking about any other professional in the organization or any other team within the organization in the same way that HR are spoken to. Yeah. And and again, like we said, I think it's that level of disrespect that then feeds into some of the verbal, the physical, the emotional abuse and violence that is going towards HR professionals. Yeah, I agree. It's then there's the element of the fact that the sorts of meetings that we're having where this sort of thing happens aren't meetings that everybody's aware of. It's usually just the people in the room and a couple of others that know it's even happening. So we're not usually called in for the good stuff, are we? No, that's very true. Right? We're not usually called in for the good stuff. They ignore us when it comes to let's have some cake. But but it's if somebody was kicking off at the all hands meeting every month and throwing punches at the CEO in front of everybody, it would be a little bit different. But it's they're not isolated incidents, but they're kind of isolated within each organization to only a few people knowing that they're even happening. Yeah. And like we said, even when they do know, what's being done about it? Because is it just being brushed under the carpet? Is it just part of the HR job? What is then happening, right? You need a function. You need some support afterwards. If it is happening, what is then happening to ensure it doesn't happen again? Is there a risk assessment? Is there a review? Is there a support? What's happening for that individual?
And
well, there should be, because it's now a foreseeable risk. So once something has happened, you can't say it's not going to happen again. So organisations should then risk assess it and put new steps in place to reduce that risk.
Is there any lower limit in terms of organisation size for this kind of thing, Darren? Because I'm thinking large organisations tend to have much more effective health and safety risk assessment, that kind of thing. But I've worked for organisations of 30 people where I know there are legal obligations, but I'm not sure if it applies. I don't know if it applies to all or not. I genuinely don't know.
Well, I mean, we do training for care homes and schools, and some of them are very, very small village schools or very small care home businesses. So, and we've done training in almost properties that are not much bigger than a house.
Right.
So, you know, Health and Safety at Work Act goes right across every organisation. Okay. Doesn't matter how small or how large you are. And within an organisation, there should be somebody who's looking at the overall health and safety of all the employers within that organisation.
Yeah,
including HR.
Should be, including really
HR. Absolutely. I'm appalled that HR isn't included in that.
But more often or not, that's the case. I've been thinking, like, once upon a time ago, I was in a room having a difficult conversation with somebody, and they stood up, like, leant over, smashed the desk bounced, got up, but as they slammed the door so hard, all of the glass broke that was around the door. The only question I got asked was, did I get a cut from the glass? It was quite terrifying. And by the next morning, the glass had already been replaced, right? So that was the end of that one. So listening to when you say should be, Darren, I'm thinking, yeah, there should be. Unfortunately, it's not always the case, though, is it? Which is the sad thing.
But that's the difference, though, Jules, isn't it? Right? That's the difference between like physical health and safety. And let's say, right, we've done a risk assessment for that. Did the glass cut you? No. Okay, therefore there is no risk, right? But actually, what about the physical, like the mental, the emotional, the well-being perspective, all of that sort of stuff? And it's that stuff. I'm sure if this guy had, hit me with the end of a shotgun as I got over to the car, we might have done a little bit of a risk, but as he just kind of, stood there threatening me with a boot full of them and one in his hand, we don't really need to do anything. Like, there was no physical harm. Like, there was a physical threat. Yeah. But it's like there was no physical harm done. So you didn't cut yourself on the glass. What's the issue?
Exactly that. And I never went in that meeting room ever again. I'm like, no, not that one. That was it was terrifying. So I attributed it to that room. You just go in a different room, right? Because everything else had been, swept under the carpet. So it's like,
one of the things that really, really struck me when I did that LinkedIn sort of poll last year was how many people had never reported what happened to them, or there wasn't a single person. And I think there were about nearly 200 people who sent me examples of things that had happened to them. Not one single person had faced any consequences at all for the violence that they had inflicted on their HR colleague. Not one.
Because it's HR.
Do you think it is? Do you really think it's that?
I do. I think it is because it is HR. If that had been towards a colleague or a manager, or, if that had been towards the CEO of the organisation, or, the person working on reception, something would have been done about it, because we would have said, this is not, like, we don't tolerate it. It's not right. This is not how we treat people. I think the fact that there is no action taken is because the assumption is it's HR.
It's a systemic thing rather than...
It's a systemic thing, but it's, again, it's not just in organisations, is it? It's, I could rant about this forever, but it's about the overall health, well-being and safety of HR. And that is physical, that is emotional, that is mental. Nobody cares. Nobody cares unless you are in HR. And again, you and I have had many, many conversations over the years, right? About the support that is out there for HR professionals. And we still then get told there's not enough support out there for HR and all of that kind of stuff. But ultimately, nobody cares about HR apart from HR.
Yeah.
That's fundamentally the issue.
Yeah.
And the majority of HR professionals don't care about themselves until they get out of it. And then they're kind of in situations like us anyway. And then we think, I can't believe I did that. Now I need to be supporting HR and this is what we're going to do about it. But there is nobody within an organization, not the health and safety officer, not the CEO, none of the leadership team or anybody, nobody cares about the health, safety and well-being, mentally, physically or emotionally of HR. And that's why we see violence and abuse and disrespect constantly within organizations, and it has to stop.
So I'm just going to address some of the comments that have just come up in the chat. Kylie, yes, there will be a recording of this webinar. I will send it out afterwards. Abida, there were some male employees who had experienced violence at the hands of female employees. But bear in mind what the demographics of HR looks like from a gender split. It was mostly women that were replying. And so the vast majority were women who had experienced violence against them from men. There were some that had experienced violence from another woman. But yeah, it was mostly women with violence from men. Kylie, your other question, I'm going to come back to Yael's question. Kylie, is it because as HR professionals, we would have insisted that action be taken if it had happened to anyone else? Yes. We're not the best at advocating for ourselves. We're shit at it. And I am not trying to make excuses or undermine anything. No, Kylie, you're absolutely right. We are not great at advocating for ourselves. I don't know why that is, but I don't think that half the time we feel like we're worth it. And I'm going to let Kelly answer the question. You've seen what she's put. Okay. Is the CIPD or any other regulatory body looking at creating any policies around this at all? Over to you, Kelly Swingler.
No, they're absolutely not. So let me just give you a little bit of a side. I'm very conscious of time. I'm going to do this as quickly as I possibly can do. I reached really severe burnout in 2013. Didn't know it was burnout, but I reached really severe burnout in 2013. Year or so later, my replacement, the replacement HRD that had gone into that organization after me, died whilst in her room on her own, whilst away on a leadership residential. 2 days after that, I received a phone call to tell me that I had become the fourth HR director to become really, really seriously ill as a result of that organization. So there's 4 of us that have become really seriously ill, and one of us has died in her room on her own whilst away on a leadership residential. I contacted the CIPD at the time to say, what are you doing to support the well-being of HR? And they told me to contact my EAP. I said that wasn't good enough. I created the world's first well-being for HR program that I was delivering around the world. I offered it to the CIPD for free for members, and they told me it was not something that they were interested in delivering. Every single year, whether it's a mental well-being day, a physical well-being day, a safety day, whatever it is, the CIPD put out about what HR need to be doing for the mental well-being of everybody within the organisation, or the stress of everybody in the organisation, or they need to be doing this, or they need to be doing that, and they need to be the other. And every single year I call them out to say, what about HR? And only 2 branches have said to me, that's a really good point. We'll mention that in our next meeting. And I've been talking about this for over 25 years. I have been self-employed for 12 years, trying to champion on this. They do not care. And I think when we look at the CIPD, and they haven't even got a succession plan or a talent management plan, and they're going to have 3 months without a CEO, the same CEO that's been there since the dawn of time, and they can't even find an internal replacement for their CEO, the CIPD needs closing. And we need a different model that does actually give a shit about the people in the organisation, including HR, in order to make changes. But the CIPD is the biggest waste of space on the planet. And if anybody is giving them any money, stop it. I'm going to stop. Thank you.
I knew that Kelly had a view on that. That's why I came to Kelly. Jules, my love, I know you've got to go. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. See you later.
I'm going to wrap this up here. I feel like we could probably do another 2-3 hours talking about this. One of the things that I've done that I will send out to everybody with the recording of this session, as part of the research that Darren was talking about, somebody put together a poster on talk down tips. and it was very much geared towards patients. I've made a couple of little tweaks to it and changed patient to employee, and I've made a version of that poster which I'm going to send out to all of you, and it gives some really practical tips around, you know, talking someone down if a situation is escalating before it gets physical. So I figured that might be useful for people, so I'm going to send that around to all of you. Thank you for joining us today, Darren, Kelly, and Jules, although she's had to pop off. Thank you so much for being involved. Darren, I'm going to get the information about the training that you guys offer up on the Evolving HR app, and
Thank you.
make sure that people are aware of it, because I love that championing idea. I think it makes an awful lot of sense for organizations to look at that. So brilliant.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me. Nice to meet you, Kelly.
And you, thank you.
Take care.
Thanks, Kirsty.
Cheers.
Bye, everybody.